The net came up wrong. Rail Dunmore had been pulling nets for 31 years. He knew the weight of a good haul, the tight, thrashing drag of fish against mesh, the way the rope burned his palms just right. He knew the weight of an empty net too, the loose, ugly swing of it, the particular way it slapped the hull when it came up with nothing. He knew both weights the way a man knows the sound of his own name. This was neither. The winch groaned. The line pulled tight at an angle it should not have. Rail cut the motor, stepped to the stern, and looked over the side with his lamp. The sea was black and wide, and the stars had not yet gone out. It was the kind of hour that belonged to nobody, too late to be night, too early to be morning. The lamp threw a yellow circle on the water, and inside that circle, tangled loosely in the outer edge of his net, something small was floating. Rail stared at it for a long moment. It was not a fish. It was not a seal pup, though he thought that first. It was curled tight, the way a dog curls in cold weather, and it was sitting on a flat piece of material that was not wood and not plastic and not anything he had a name for. The material was dark silver and smooth, and it sat on the surface without sinking, which was already strange. The creature on top of it was stranger still. Scales. That was the first thing he could say for certain. Not skin, not fur, scales, small and close set, the color of deep water in the lamplight. For limbs tucked under a body no bigger than a large house cat. A tail that curled at the tip. A head that was too angular for any animal he knew, with a short blunt snout, and two closed eyes and small ridges running back along the skull like the spines of a fin. It made a sound. That was what moved him, not the strangeness of it, not the scale material or the alien shape or the fact that nothing like this existed in any record he had ever read. It was the sound, small and thin and broken, like something with no energy left had been crying for a long time and had nearly run out of the ability to do even that. Rail reached down and freed the net from around the flat piece of debris. He put on his heavy gloves. He leaned over the gunwale as far as his back would allow, and he picked the creature up with both hands. It was warm. That surprised him. He had expected cold, the wet cold of the sea. Instead, it was warm under his palms, a dry warmth, and it weighed almost nothing. It did not fight him. It tucked its limbs tighter and pressed its face against his sleeve and made that sound again. He stood there on the deck of the gray kelp, 400 kilometers from the nearest port, holding something that should not exist, and he made a decision without thinking about it the way people make decisions without thinking when the situation is simple enough. He carried it inside. The cabin of the gray kelp was cluttered and smelled of salt and diesel and the particular damp of old rope that never fully dries. Rail set the creature down on the bench along the starboard wall and pulled his old canvas coat from the hook by the door. He wrapped it loosely. The creature did not resist. It turned once, slowly, the way an exhausted animal turns before it stops moving, and then it stilled. He put the kettle on. While the water heated, he stood against the opposite wall and looked at it. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had pulled strange things from the sea before, deep water fish that looked like nightmares. Once a piece of aircraft wreckage from a crash no one had reported. He had seen enough to know the sea kept its own inventory and shared it on the sea's own schedule, not a human one. But this was different from any of that, and he knew it. The piece of material the creature had been resting on was still outside on the deck. He went and got it. Under the cabin light, it was clearer, not just flat, but slightly curved, like a panel from something larger. The edges were sheared clean in a way no wave action would produce. There were markings on the inner surface that were not scratches. They were deliberate, regular, and he could not read them. Part of something, he thought. Something that broke. He set the panel against the wall and poured his tea. The creature slept. Its sides moved in a slow, even rhythm, and every few minutes it made a small sound in its sleep, not the crying sound from before, something quieter, like a sigh. Its scales, now that he could look closely, were not a single color. They shifted between teal and deep blue depending on how the light caught them. The ridges along its skull were faint gold. The tip of its tail, curled out from under the coat, was the same gold color. Rail sat down across from it. He wrapped both hands around his mug. Outside, the sea moved against the hull the way it always did, patient and indifferent to everything. He thought about calling the Coast Guard. He thought about calling his daughter Sarah, who worked at the research station up the coast and knew more about marine biology than anyone he had ever met. He thought about what would happen when he radioed in a report of an unknown species, what would come after, how fast it would come, and who it would come for. He looked at the creature. He looked at the way it had pressed its face against his sleeve. He thought about the sound it had been making when he found it. He finished his tea. He did not make any calls. He went back to the wheel, turned the gray kelp toward home, and let the creature sleep. The stars faded above him as he went. The sea was long and gray and quiet. The lamp in the cabin threw its light through the salt, fogged glass of the porthole, warm and steady in the dark. Somewhere under the coat, the creature breathed. Rail kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the water ahead, and did not think too hard about what came next. He had found something that was hurting and alone, and he had brought it in out of the cold. The rest was a problem for the morning. The morning was still a long way off. He drove on. Sarah Dunmore had not spoken to her father in 3 weeks when he called. That was not unusual. Rail was not a man who called often. He sent short messages, sometimes a photo of a decent catch, a note about weather, the occasional question about a fish species that had ended up in his net. Whole months could pass with very little between them. Sarah had grown up understanding that her father expressed things mostly by doing them rather than saying them, which was fine except when she needed him to say them, which was a problem they had never quite worked out. So when he called and said he needed her to come look at something, and his voice was careful in a way she recognized as him trying not to sound careful, she asked no questions. She packed a bag and drove 4 hours down the coast road to the small house where she had grown up and where he had lived alone since her mother died. He met her at the door. "It is in the shed," he said. "Hello to you too," she said. He led her across the yard without answering. The shed behind the house was where he kept spare engine parts and old fishing equipment and approximately 40 things he had meant to throw away for the past decade. He opened the door and stood back and let her go in first. She stopped after 2 steps. The creature was sitting on a folded tarpaulin in the corner. It had been there for 11 days at this point, long enough to eat. Rail had not known what to feed it, so he had tried several things, and it had accepted raw fish with the quiet seriousness of something that needed food more than it needed to be selective about it. It was stronger than it had been. It held its head up. When Sarah walked in, it turned to look at her with 2 golden eyes that were fully open and fully aware, and she felt, in a way she could not immediately explain, that it was deciding something about her. "Dad," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not a marine species." "I know." "That is not any kind of species." "I know that too." She crouched down. She was a scientist, and she had the scientist's instinct to reach for a notebook and a specimen bag and a set of measurements. But she did not do any of that. She stayed still and let the creature look at her. After a moment, it made a low sound in its throat, not threatening, more like a question, and then it stood up on all 4 legs and walked toward her and pressed its snout against her knee. Sarah sat down on the floor of her father's shed and let it. "How long?" she said. 11 days. "You have had this in your shed for 11 days, and you did not call anyone." "I called you." She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the expression he had worn since she was small, the one that meant he had thought about something carefully and arrived at a position and was not going to explain the position in any detail. She had always found it maddening. Right now she found it maddening for different reasons. "I need to photograph everything," she said. "Every marking, every scale pattern, the shape of the skull. I need measurements, and I need to know what you have fed it and how much and how often. And I need you to tell me exactly where you found it and show me that panel you brought in off the water, because I have already seen it leaning against the wall in the cabin, and I have some thoughts about what that material is, and none of those thoughts are calming." Rail unfolded his arms. "Are you hungry?" he said. "I made soup." "Yes," she said. "But after?" She spent 4 hours in the shed that first day. The creature, she refused to name it before she understood it, which lasted approximately 1 day before she stopped being able to think of it, as simply the creature tolerated her examination with a patience that itself told her something. It was not wild. It was not feral. It watched everything she did with a focus that was not animal. When she held up her penlight to examine its eyes, it tilted its head at a precise angle that gave her a better view, as though it understood what she was doing and was helping. By the end of the first week, they had established the following. It was young, very young, probably 6 to 8 weeks old based on scale development. It was female. It was in good health now, though the signs of dehydration and cold exposure from its time at sea were still visible if you knew what to look for. It was not communicating in any way Sarah could measure, but it was clearly communicating. She would reach for a tool and find it watching her hand. She would speak, and it would listen with an attention that most humans could not maintain. Rail would come in from outside, and it would stand up before it could possibly have heard his footsteps. The markings changed things. Sarah had been cross-referencing the scale patterns and the ridge structure against every database she could access without flagging her search terms. On the 14th day, she found a partial match in a leaked file from the Interspecies Relations Board biological classification records for confirmed extraterrestrial species. The file was 3 years old and incomplete, but the ridge configuration was there, described under the heading Draconis Conclave, High Brood Biological Markers, Restricted Classification. She sat very still for a while after she read that. Then she went outside where her father was fixing a motor part on the back step, and she said, "Dad, she is not just some creature from somewhere." He looked up. "She is royalty," Sarah said, "by whatever measure they use. Her bloodline is one of the oldest in the Conclave's records." Rail was quiet for a moment. He looked at the shed door. "She still eats the same fish," he said. "That is not the point." "It is a little bit the point." Sarah sat down on the step beside him. They were quiet together for a moment, the way they sometimes managed to be when the silence between them stopped being about all the things they had not said to each other and became something more comfortable. "Someone is going to come looking," she said. "Yes. We cannot hide her forever." "No." "But not yet," she said, and surprised herself by saying it. He nodded once. Inside the shed, in the corner on the folded tarpaulin, the hatchling waited. She had learned over the past 2 weeks that the large pale creatures came and went and always came back. She had learned that the older one smelled of salt and engine oil and was quiet in a way that felt safe. She had learned that the younger one was louder and moved faster and asked more questions, but that her hands were very gentle. She had not yet found the words to tell them what she remembered. The dark, the cold, the long silence of open space followed by the longer silence of open sea. The sound of the net, the lamp above her. She was working on it. She pressed her face into the coat that the older one had left in the corner for her, and she rested, and she waited for him to come back. He always came back. Outside, a government drone passed silently over the property at high altitude. It circled once and moved on. Neither Rail nor Sarah noticed it. The night came in off the water, and the shed was warm, and the hatchling slept. 3 ships uncloaked over the coastline on a Tuesday. There was no warning. One moment the sky above the North Varan coast was clear and bright, the kind of pale autumn blue that made the sea look like hammered tin. The next moment there were 3 structures in low orbit that had not been there before, and the fact of their size was visible even from the ground, dark shapes that interrupted the blue the way a thumb covers a light, massive and unhurried. The alerts went out within minutes. The Interspecies Relations Board had a protocol for unannounced conclave contact. They had drilled it many times. They had never expected to actually use it, which meant that when they did, it took slightly longer than the drills had suggested it would, and several people who were supposed to be calm were not particularly calm. The transmission came 40 minutes after the ships appeared. It was addressed to the board directly, in flat and unaccented human speech that had clearly been produced by translation software rather than learned. Admiral Drovin of the Draconis Conclave, 3rd Migration Fleet, required the immediate return of any biological material belonging to the Conclave that had been located within human-controlled territory. The word immediate appeared 3 times. The word negotiation did not appear at all. Counselor Wynne read the transmission twice. She was a careful woman who had spent 20 years in interstellar diplomatic work and had learned to read what was not written as well as what was. What was not written here was anything that acknowledged a possibility that this biological material had been well treated. What was not written was any expression of relief that it had been found. What was not written was please. She called the 2 people she needed to call, and then she drove 4 hours down a coastal road she had never driven before, to a small house that was not in any official record yet, because whoever had filed that drone report had been careful about what they put in writing. Rail answered the door before she could knock. He had clearly seen her car coming up the unpaved drive and had used the time to form an opinion about her. He looked at her the way he probably looked at weather, not with hostility, but with the particular patience of someone who has seen enough incoming things to know it is better to wait and assess than to react immediately. He was older than she expected, with a face that had been in sea wind for most of its life. He did not seem frightened. That was the first thing that surprised her. "You are from the board," he said. "Counselor Wynne." "Yes." "Come in," he said, and stepped back. The house was small and clean in the way of someone who does not own much and takes care of what they have. There was a daughter at the table with a laptop and 3 notebooks open around it. She looked up and her expression was wary but not hostile. The shed door was visible through the back window. Wynne sat down. She explained the situation plainly because she was not a person who wasted time on softening things. 3 Conclave ships in orbit. A formal demand. A timeline that was already running. She told them that the board had very limited grounds to resist the demand, that the Hatchling was Conclave property under existing interspecies law, and that the cleanest outcome for everyone was a straightforward transfer carried out promptly and without complications. When she finished, Rail poured her a glass of water and set it in front of her and said, "No." She had expected resistance. She had expected it to be angry or fearful or legal in nature. The simple word surprised her. "I understand the position you are in," she said carefully. "But a Class 3 species refusing a direct Conclave demand is not a position the board can support." "I am not refusing," he said. "I am saying no to how you want to do it. A cold box and strangers in suits." "No." "Then what are you proposing?" "Someone comes down here. In person. No suits, no equipment. Looks me in the eye and tells me they know who she is and that she is going to be safe. Then I will walk her out myself." Wynne looked at the daughter, who was watching her father with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and proud. She looked back at Rail. "Admiral Droven is not a being who accepts conditions from individuals of a Class 3 species," she said. "That is his problem," Rail said. Wynne was quiet for a moment. She was recalculating several things at once, which was something she was good at. "Can I see her?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up and led her to the back door and across the yard to the shed. She stepped inside. She had read the biological records. She had seen the photographs Sarah had submitted through the board's encrypted channel. None of it prepared her for the reality of the hatchling looking at her with those gold eyes, or for the thing that happened next, a warmth that moved through her chest without any physical source, a pulse of something that was not a word but carried the same weight as a greeting. Friendly, curious, a little uncertain. Wynne stood very still. She was a professional. She had trained herself not to be moved by things in the course of her work. She excused herself and went back outside and stood in the yard with the cold coastal wind in her face and breathed for a moment. Rail came out and stood nearby without saying anything, which she was grateful for. In the orbital ships above, Admiral Droven's staff were tracking 16 variables related to the retrieval operation. Down in the yard of a small coastal property, one of those variables was standing in the wind with her hand pressed to her sternum, revising everything she had planned to say. And in the shed, a young Conclave scout named Brack was watching through a cloaked lens mounted on a drone he had positioned in a tree at the property's edge. He watched the hatchling walk to the door of the shed and put her nose against the gap at the bottom, toward the place where the fisherman had gone. He wrote in his report, "Subject distressed by separation from human contact." Then he sat for a while looking at what he had written. He deleted it. He wrote, "Subject behavior inconclusive." He filed that instead. He was not sure why. He filed it anyway. Above them all, the 3 dark ships held their position in the pale sky and waited. The platform had been built in 48 hours on a stretch of flat coastal rock where the land met the sea. The board had arranged it, which meant it was practical and symmetrical and conveyed a deliberate neutrality that pleased no one. There were no decorations and no flags. There was a table, 2 sets of chairs, and a space between them wide enough that neither side had to feel too close to the other. Admiral Droven descended from the orbital vessel in a shuttle that was noticeably larger than it needed to be for the number of beings it carried. This was not an accident. The shuttle was a statement. It landed on the platform with a sound like a slow exhale of pressure and sat there looking like something that had no business being so close to the ground. Droven stepped out with 8 officers flanking him, and he was nothing like what Rail had imagined. He was tall, not extremely so, but the way he held himself added to it. His scales were a darker color than Vora's, almost charcoal, with a faint iridescence that caught even the flat coastal light. The ridges on his skull were more pronounced, sharper. He moved with the particular stillness of something that had never needed to hurry because the world generally arranged itself around his schedule. He looked at Rail the way you look at a piece of furniture that has been left in an inconvenient place. Sarah was standing to Rail's left. Wynn was to his right. Behind all three of them, Vora pressed close to Rail's leg. She had felt the ships before they had even left the house that morning. She had gone quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet tight, like something bracing. She had stayed pressed against Rail on the drive to the platform, and when they had stepped out into the open air, and she had looked up and seen the shuttle, she had made a low sound in her throat that Rail had not heard from her before. He had put his hand on her neck. She had not moved away from it. Now she stood beside him on the platform while Droven crossed the distance between them and stopped at a point clearly calculated to be authoritative without being confrontational. He looked at Rail without expression. He looked at Vora for a moment longer. Then he spoke, and Wynn translated in a low voice. The Conclave was prepared to process the return of its biological material in an orderly manner. Rail and his family unit would be compensated appropriately for any inconvenience. The board would receive a formal note of acknowledgement for their cooperation. All that remained was the transfer. Rail said nothing. Droven looked at him more directly. Wynn translated again. The Admiral required confirmation of compliance. Rail still said nothing. He looked at Droven in a way that was not rude or aggressive. He was simply waiting, the way a fisherman waits, with the patience of someone who understands that pulling too early loses the line. And then Vora moved. She walked forward 3 paces away from Rail's hand, out to the middle space of the platform between the two groups. She was small next to the Conclave officers. She was barely half the height of the shortest one. She sat down in the center of the platform, and she looked up at Admiral Droven, and she opened her mouth, and she did nothing with it. No sound came out, but every Conclave officer on the platform stopped moving in the same instant, like a piece of machinery that has had its power cut. Rail felt it too. Not heard, felt. A pressure behind his eyes that was not painful, just suddenly full, like a room that had too much light in it. And then the light organized itself into something. He saw the dark. Not sleep dark, not night dark. The particular dark of deep space with no ship and no warmth and nothing in any direction that could help. He felt the cold in a way he had not felt it at the time, because at the time he had been managing the cold. But the memory of it was different from the experience, and the memory said, this was the cold that ends things. He felt 9 days of it. And then he felt the lamp. Just that. Yellow light from an old lamp held over the side of an old boat. It landed on the cold and the dark and the 9 days of drifting, and it was so ordinary and so present and so warm that it cut straight through all of it. And then hands. Gloved hands that did not hesitate. The broadcast lasted perhaps 10 seconds. When it ended, the platform was very quiet. Rail was looking at the deck boards. He was aware that his jaw was tight. He was aware that he did not particularly want to look up at anyone right now, not because he was ashamed, but because there was too much feeling in him at the moment, and he was not made for letting people see that. Sarah had both hands over her mouth. Wynn was looking at the sky. Among the Conclave officers, the stillness was different from before. Before it had been the controlled stillness of beings maintaining rank. This was the stillness of beings that had just had something land in them that they had not prepared for and did not know where to put. Droven was looking at the hatchling. His face, which had shown nothing since he stepped off the shuttle, was showing something now. Not much, but something. He spoke. Wynn translated after a moment, her voice carefully level. The Admiral asks why you did not report the find to the appropriate interstellar authorities immediately upon discovery. Rail looked up. He looked at Droven across the platform. She was crying, he said. It took Wynn a moment to translate it. She did, in the flat, accurate speech of a careful diplomat. Droven said nothing for a long time. The sea moved against the rocks below the platform. The wind came in off the water. 8 Conclave officers stood very still and did not look at their commanding officer's face. Vora turned around and walked back to Rail and sat on his foot. He looked down at her. He put his hand on the back of her neck, the same place he always did. Droven watched this. He watched it for longer than seemed necessary for a military officer conducting a retrieval operation. Then he said something very quietly in the Conclave tongue. Wynn did not translate it immediately. When Rail asked her later what it meant, she was quiet for a moment before she said it translated roughly to, "I have made an error in my understanding." The formal transfer proceeding that Drovin's staff had prepared did not take place that afternoon. Instead, there was a conversation. It was not comfortable. It was not friendly. But it was a conversation, which was more than anyone had expected to have when the day started. Rail stood on the platform in his old coat with a hatchling sitting on his foot, and he answered the Admiral's questions plainly and without embellishment. And Drovin listened with the expression of someone recalculating something important, and the three dark ships waited in the sky above them all and held their position and did not fire anything at anyone. Which, all things considered, was a reasonable outcome for the day. Nobody told Rail what to bring to space. Wynn had given him a list of things not to bring: nothing electronic that had not been cleared, nothing with volatile chemistry, no recording equipment of any kind. She had given him a briefing document about Conclave customs that was 40 pages long and that he read about 12 pages of before he put it down and made himself a sandwich. She had told him the shuttle would arrive at 6 in the morning and that he should be ready. He was ready at 5:45. He had his coat. He had a change of clothes in a bag. He had a thermos of tea because he was not going into orbit without tea, and he did not care what anyone said about it. Sarah was coming too. This had not been part of the original arrangement, but Vora had made her preference clear by the simple method of refusing to board the shuttle if Sarah was not also boarding the shuttle. And no one on the Conclave diplomatic staff had found a clean way to argue with a high-brewed hatchling who sat down and looked at them. The shuttle ride was 40 minutes of Rail staring out a small window while the blue sky thinned and went dark, and the stars came out in a way they never quite did from the ground, hard and constant and everywhere. He drank his tea. Sarah typed notes into her tablet. Vora sat between them with her head on Rail's knee and watched the stars with an expression he had started to recognize as her thinking face. The orbital station was larger than he had prepared himself for. He had seen photographs, but photographs did not carry the actual scale of a structure that had been built by a civilization with 10,000 years of practice. It was not sleek in the way human spacecraft tried to be. It was old, clearly and undeniably old, with the layered complexity of something that had been added to and expanded and modified across many generations until it had become its own kind of landscape rather than a vehicle. A junior officer named Brack met them at the docking bay. Rail had been told a little about Brack by Wynn: that he was young, that he had been the one operating the surveillance drone over the property, that he had filed a report describing the hatchling's behavior as inconclusive when the footage clearly showed something much more specific than that. Rail looked at him and thought that the young officer had the face of someone who was trying to appear like he had no feelings about anything, which usually meant the opposite. Brack led them through the station. The corridors were tall, designed for beings larger than humans, and quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if noise had been factored out of the design. Other Conclave crew members they passed slowed to look at Rail and Sarah, and then looked at Vora, and their expressions changed in ways Rail could not read precisely, but understood in general terms. Surprise. Something that might have been discomfort. He kept walking. They were brought to the Hall of Lineage. It was not a room. It was a space, and the distinction mattered. The ceiling was far enough above them that Rail could not see it clearly. The walls were covered from floor to that invisible ceiling in crystal panels, each one glowing faintly from inside, each one carved with records that wound around each other in dense, layered patterns. The air tasted different in here, older somehow, which was not a scientific observation but was accurate nonetheless. Admiral Drovin was waiting. He led them along the central path without speaking. After a moment, he indicated a particular section of the crystal wall and spoke, and Brack translated quietly. This was the beginning of the lineage to which the hatchling belonged. 12,000 years of recorded history. The first of that line had crossed 4-star systems before most species in this sector had discovered fire. Rail looked at the wall. He looked at Vora, who was walking close beside him and looking at the crystal panels with an expression of recognition, as though these records meant something to her that went beyond reading. Then he said, "If this bloodline is so important to you, why was she on that ship?" Drovin turned to look at him. Rail continued, plainly, the way he asked any question he actually wanted an answer to. A 6-week hatchling from a line 12,000 years old, on an old migration vessel, through an unmapped debris corridor. Why was she on that particular ship, going that particular route, with no escort capable of surviving a debris strike? The hall was very quiet. Brack was not translating yet, because Droven had not responded yet. "I am not a diplomat," Rail said. "I do not know your politics. But I know old boats and I know when something is using a route, because it does not want to be noticed. That ship was chosen because it was small enough to go unnoticed. And I think the reason it needed to go unnoticed is worth knowing." Droven said something then. Brack translated it without expression, which took visible effort. The hatchling's clutch had been the subject of a succession dispute at the capital. The transport had been arranged quietly to remove the hatchling from the political environment until the dispute was resolved. The vessel had been selected for its low profile rather than its safety record. The silence after that was different from the earlier silences. Earlier silences had been diplomatic silences, the kind people fill with subtext. This one was plain. Sarah was already opening one of her notebooks. "I have a complete record," she said, addressing Droven directly through Brack, "of every day of her recovery. What she ate, how she slept, the signs of exposure, the rate of her recovery. I documented it as a scientist because it was important data." She held up the notebook. "It is also, whether I intended it or not, a record of a child being cared for. You are welcome to keep a copy." She set it on the floor because there was no table near enough and she was not going to hand it to an escort and have it disappear. Several of the Conclave officers present had moved slightly, not retreated, but shifted in a way that communicated something internal and not entirely comfortable. Droven looked at the notebook on the floor of the Hall of Lineage for a moment. Then he looked at Vora, who had walked to Rael's side and was leaning against him with her eyes on the Admiral. Brack, translating in a low voice, told them that the Conclave legal team had found a clause. An old one, rarely cited, never invoked in the modern era. A high-brood hatchling in extraordinary circumstances was entitled to formally designate a first warden from outside their own species. It was not a common provision. The situations that required it had historically been uncommon. Brack paused. Then he said, in a voice that was trying to stay neutral, "She invoked it this morning. Before we docked. She invoked it, and she named you." He was looking at Rael when he said it. Rael did not say anything for a moment. He looked down at Vora. She was looking up at him with those gold eyes, and she sent him something that was not quite a word. It was the image of his coat in the corner of the shed, the smell of the cabin, the lamp over the side of the boat. An explanation. "This is why. This is what it means." He put his hand on her head. "All right," he said. It was not the most dramatic thing anyone had ever said in the Hall of Lineage. It was probably the shortest sentence ever spoken in that space on a matter of legal consequence. But Brack translated it faithfully, and Droven heard it. And above all of them, 12,000 years of crystal history caught the light and held it. Outside the station, the stars continued their ancient business, indifferent and permanent and very far away. On a small planet below, the North Varen Sea moved against a familiar coastline, and an old fishing boat sat in its berth and waited. 6 months after a fisherman pulled a hatchling from the North Varen Sea, a document was signed that no one had managed to produce in 40 years of trying. It was not the trade agreement that Earth's governments had been chasing since first contact. It was not a military alliance or a technology exchange. It was 4 pages long, written in 3 languages, and its central commitment was simple. The Draconis Conclave formally recognized humanity as a protected contact species, which meant no interference in internal governance, no coercive trade conditions, and an open door for voluntary cultural exchange should either party choose to walk through it. The board held a formal signing ceremony. Wynne gave a speech that was good and appropriately measured. There were photographs taken that would end up in history records and school textbooks. It was an important day. Rael did not attend. He sent his apologies through Sarah and went fishing instead. He was not trying to make a point. He had nets to pull, and the weather window that week was narrow, and the sea did not care about signing ceremonies. He had turned down everything they offered him. The title of Interspecies Liaison Representative, First Class. A seat on the newly formed Conclave Human Cultural Council. An honorary research position at 3 different institutions. A government stipend described as compensation for his role in a historic diplomatic event. He had looked at all of it the way he looked at fish that were too small, not with contempt. Just the simple judgment that it was not what he was here for. He asked for one thing. that Vora be allowed to visit, and not be placed in a conclave nursery and taught to forget, and not be used as a political symbol for either side. He put this in writing through Win, in plain language, with no diplomatic softening. The conclave legal team had debated the first warden designation for 6 weeks and ultimately confirmed it was valid and binding. This meant Rail's request carried legal weight whether Droven found it convenient or not. Droven, to Win's private amazement, agreed. Nobody on the board fully understood why. Brack understood, but he was a junior officer and no one was asking him. He had written in his personal log, not his official reports, that the Admiral had returned from the Hall of Lineage visit and spent 3 hours in his private quarters and had not spoken to anyone unnecessarily for 4 days after, which was unusual enough to be noted. Brack suspected that a question had landed in the Admiral and was still working its way through him. He had seen it happen to himself. He thought about the footage from the drone. The hatchling walking to the shed door and pressing her nose to the gap. The fisherman sitting on a cold deck at 4 in the morning with something that should have terrified him asleep across his lap, and looking for all the world like a man who had simply done a reasonable thing and seen no reason to be fussed about it. It turned out that was the part that was hard to stop thinking about. Brack had been reassigned as Vora's official conclave escort for her visits to Earth. He had not requested the posting. When it was offered, he had said yes before the offer was finished. He was on the gray kelp for the 3rd visit when Sarah told him, over coffee in the small cabin, that she had been offered a joint research position with a conclave biological sciences team and was considering it seriously. He told her, with more feeling than he had meant to show, that she would be a significant asset. She looked at him sideways and said, "Thank you," in a tone that suggested she was trying not to smile. These things happened in the margins of history, quiet and small and consequential. Vora herself had changed. She was larger, noticeably so, even in 6 months, the way young things grow fast when they are well fed and safe. Her scales had deepened in color, more blue than teal now, catching the light of different skies. She spoke in full psionic sentences, and she had learned, over many patient sessions with Rail on the deck of the gray kelp, how to produce 2 words in spoken human language. The first word was Rail. She said it in the early morning when she came aboard, and it sounded like nothing a human throat could have made, but it was clearly the word. The second word was T, which she had decided was important based on how often the humans around her used it, and which she said with a conviction that suggested she considered it a fundamental concept. She still slept in the old canvas coat. It had been washed many times by now, and it no longer smelled of salt and engine oil in any detectable way, but she slept in it regardless. This was not symbolic. She was simply attached to it, and Rail saw no reason to take it away. On a morning in early winter, 6 months after the signing and 7 months after the night he had leaned over the gunwale with his lamp, Rail took the gray kelp out before dawn. Vora came with him. She rode the bow the way she always did, now settled low against the hull, her head up, watching the water ahead with the particular attention of something that is both comfortable and interested. Brack stayed at the dock. He had offered to come. Rail had said that too was company. The sky went through its colors, black to gray to the particular pale gold of early winter light that sits very low and flat on the water and makes everything look like it has an edge around it. The nets went down. The nets came up. The sea moved the way the sea always moved, which was to say it moved without reference to anything that was happening on or above it. Sarah's voice came over the radio from shore. She had been at the research station overnight and was calling to check on weather conditions before she drove back. She asked if there was anything interesting out there. Rail stood at the wheel. The sun was coming up red behind the low clouds on the eastern horizon. On the bow, Vora had turned to look at something far out on the water, some seabird or movement he couldn't see from his position, and she was watching it with her full attention, gold eyes steady, her tail slowly moving once like a slow flag in the wind. 7 months ago he had leaned over the side of this same boat and picked up a creature who was crying alone in the dark and brought her in out of the cold. He had done it the way you do things when the decision is plain enough that it is not actually a decision, only a thing that obviously has to happen. He had not imagined that it would amount to much more than that. He pressed the radio button. "Just the usual," he said. He put both hands back on the wheel. The gray kelp moved north across the winter water, steady and unhurried. The sky was wide and pale above them. The stars had not quite gone out yet at the western edge of it, holding on past their time the way stars sometimes do, faint and stubborn in the growing light. Vora turned back from whatever she had been watching and settled lower against the bow. She sent him something without being asked, a small and easy thing. Just warmth, the way she had learned to say good morning. He felt it the same way he always did, like a lamp coming on in a dark room. He did not say anything back. He did not need to. The sea stretched ahead of them, open and long, and the day came in with no particular interest in being remarkable, and the two of them crossed it together.